Alright guys, so let's focus on the Middle East today and what the United States is plotting. Now if you think Trump's trade war was bad, this move will take things to the next level. It's very well known that the Trump White House doesn't like Iran, and this time he wants to target the lifeline of the Iranian economy. But there's a big problem. It's going to piss off America's biggest rival. In an interview, Scott Bessent, the new Treasury head, confirmed the unthinkable that the US is plotting to cut Iranian oil flows by over 90%. We are committed to bringing the Iranians back to 100,000 barrels a day of oil exports. This is not just a threat, this is a commitment from the US that Iran's oil industry is about to get smashed. Now, during the Biden administration, Iranian exports have been growing. It has reached over 1.6 million barrels per day now. However, there's a massive problem. It's also a threat that directly affects China. Besson is courting danger because this is an existential move to Beijing's economy. Besides buying cheap Russian gas, China has a very diversified energy mix. They import oil, they import LNG from various parts of the world, and Iran is a very significant supplier to the Chinese economy. China buys over 90% of Iran's oil exports. When Tehran exports 10 barrels to the world, 9 barrels of crude ends up with a Chinese refiner. So when Scott Bessent is talking about hammering Iran's exports down, he's talking about hitting Chinese manufacturing as well. China is fearless about buying sanctioned energy, and that's why their industries are just so competitive. Affordable oil and gas, it's part of the Chinese supply chain network, and it is existential for them. Let's not forget the landscape China is operating in today. The Western world is highly hostile to their industries. In fact, the US has outright declared economic war on Chinese exports. Trump has imposed an additional 10% tariff on China, and unlike Canada or Mexico, the tariffs are still in effect. And this will target $525 billion worth of Chinese exports into the United States. While this hurts US consumers directly, there will be a portion of exports that will get hit. Now, the overall tariff rates on many Chinese exports are 50% or more, so companies might have to lower their prices or divert shipments away from the US to other markets. Revenue and profits could take a tangible hit. China has to fire on all cylinders to make their exports even more competitive, and that means ensuring their critical inputs, especially energy, is affordable. Besson punishing Iranian oil also means punishing China, and he has confirmed the plan during a congressional hearing as well. So this isn't a myth, an energy war is coming.
I would view that as we can raise U.S. production, we would squeeze down the bad actors, especially Iran. I believe Iran was down to 100,000 barrels of oil exports when President Trump left office. I believe that they are now exporting in excess or approximately 1.7 million. So through sanctions policy, I believe that we can, again, as I like to say, make Iran poor again. Not the Iranian people, the Iranian government. And then at the same time, they have our domestic producers push that up with the highest energy standards in the world.
So Besson's plan is very simple here. Starve the Iranian economy of revenue by hammering down their oil exports through sanctions policy. Now, the US can't directly control Iran's production without destroying their oil infrastructure, so sanctions are the next best solution. Besson has imposed sanctions on a global network shipping Iranian oil to China. Iran generates over $3 billion a month selling crude just to Beijing, and the US wants to cut that revenue away. So if ships dare to transport Iranian oil to China, they could be punished, assets could get confiscated and cut away from SWIFT. Worst of all, Chinese banks might get hit with sanctions. The US is walking on a very thin line because hitting the Chinese banking sector is the last thing you want to do. Since 2020, Iran's oil production has been increasing. The Biden administration levied a ton of sanctions on Iranian oil, but production went from under 2 million barrels a day to 3.3 million, and it's still climbing. Now, US enforcement is not working. Iran has a deep network of shadow vessels that is similar to how Russia gets their oil around. It's impossible to go after each ship and trace the origin of every crude shipment. If Besson wants to enforce the sanctions, he would have to go after China. Punishing Chinese refineries, well, that's pointless. So the only target left would be the Chinese banks. But the blowback effects would be severe, even for the United States. China is the biggest importer of crude oil in the world, and they buy nearly 12 million barrels a day. Oil is a global market and China won't starve. They have a big network of suppliers and will easily make up the shortfall. The issue here is the price Beijing will be forced to pay and how it will affect crude prices. China's biggest supplier of crude is Russia, supplying over 2.2 million barrels a day. Supply from Malaysia and Iraq has also increased. China would simply import more from these countries. If Iranian oil gets sanctioned away, China will buy more oil from a smaller pool of supply. And now global prices will rise, hurting the EU and the United States as well. There's a reason why China loves Iranian oil. The discount they get is very, very significant. In 2023, China saved more than $10 billion buying oil from countries under Western sanctions. And this includes Russian crude and, of course, oil from Iran. Beijing isn't afraid of US sanctions, so they have the guts to buy from these countries. It's a key reason why China can outcompete the world when it comes to manufacturing. Now, this goes well beyond just burning oil for power. Oil is a very flexible input for the entire Chinese supply chain. A barrel of crude oil can be refined into various products: diesel for trucks, jet fuel for planes, and fuel oil for cargo ships. The inputs for petrochemicals to make tires and plastics also originate from crude oil as well. By getting cheap Iranian crude, Chinese products across the board are more affordable. It's a big reason why China will retaliate if the US goes ahead to punish Iran. And it's very predictable how Beijing will fight back here. Trump's strategy in this economic war is straightforward. He is weaponizing the US consumer market by imposing tariffs on the world, including China. However, that's a very blunt instrument that hurts your own consumers. Beijing is more nuanced. They aren't interested in punishing their own people, but their intended target. And that's why we are seeing critical export bans to the US. Now, the United States wants to reshore critical industries like semiconductors and solar manufacturing. But guess who controls the resources Trump needs? It's China. This is a list of critical minerals the US needs and are highly dependent on Chinese imports. Now, take rare earths for example. 74% of imports comes from China, 64% for bismuth, 54% for germanium, and over 50% for gallium. All three are critical inputs to make semiconductor chips. So you can see the quandary the US faces. Why do you think Scott Bessent went all the way to Ukraine for $500 billion of rare earths? Because that is a glaring weak point in US industries. If Trump sanctions away Iranian oil, China's response would be to sanction away critical resources. And this will make his plan to reshore industries even more impossible. Now, yes, Trump can give companies tax cuts. The US is also energy self-sufficient. But if you don't even have the inputs, the raw materials to make the stuff, what's the point in building factories in the US? Now, in December, China already banned germanium, gallium, and antimony. These are industrial and military metals, and China is an expert at this tit-for-tat trade war. While the US can block chip exports to China, Beijing will simply refuse to allow US companies to make the chips in the first place. It's all very ironic. But realize there's a deeper agenda why the US wants to push down Iranian exports to China. Making Iran poor again is not really the key reason. Besson is trying to protect the US dollar as the reserve currency, and maintaining the petrodollar system is very important here. The US wants the world to buy energy using dollars and nothing else, and China's making things very, very difficult.
You see things happening on the margin. This Shanghai Gold Exchange, very interesting. We see India and China being able to pay for oil, which is the ultimate dollar commodity, and the rupees and RMB. So you've now moved the US out of the way. So, and I'll tell you, is the real wake up call for me was last December, and we were doing a call with one of our consultants, the much older fellow, great thinker, and French, and he said, like I was used to, okay, the U.S. has sanctioned Venezuela, the U.S. has sanctioned Russia, U.S. has sanctioned Iran, and he said, it is untenable that the U.S. can extend its foreign policy to the French government via the dollar, and just this huge multi-billion-dollar fine on BNP is going to make a U.S. ally want to think of a new way of doing business. So, like you have this new term, the global South, that wants out of the dollar system. Very interesting if French Republic wants out of the dollar system.
So you just heard Scott Bessent revealing the true agenda. He knows the world, including the French, are sick of the dollar system. They are tired of US sanctions and getting punished. Now, most of these countries can't do a thing, especially those in the EU, but China can. And because Beijing is the biggest oil importer in the world, they are already de-dollarizing their oil trade. We just need to look at China and Russia. Since 2022, Russia has been exporting over $10 billion worth of oil and gas every single month. And by late 2023, 100% were paid for using the Chinese RMB. In fact, Russia is selling their exports to other countries for the Chinese currency. Russia is willing to accept the RMB because China's economy is just so enormous. And that's why the US wants to clamp down on Iranian oil going into China. Because dollars aren't being used to settle the trade between them for sure, 100%. I don't believe Iran and China are settling using the greenback. Iran is shipping Beijing the oil, China is paying them using their own local currency, the RMB. Everything comes back to the dollar and how the US is desperate to cling on to its hegemony. It underpins the entire economy. And why do you think Trump threatened BRICS with a 100% tariff? It's a dead giveaway. The US economy is facing an unprecedented debt crisis. Debt to GDP is at 101% today. The amount of money owed is already more than the entire economy. But by 2054, this amount will shoot past the World War II peak and hit nearly 170% of GDP. The US can't afford countries not to buy its debt. We are at a point where lack of demand could spike yields and make interest payments even more unsustainable. And the most basic way to drive demand is to make the dollar more useful. As Bessent puts it, he wants Iran's oil exports to drop while increasing US oil exports at the same time. And when the US sells their crude, they will definitely demand to be paid in dollars. It's not controversial, everything is hiding in plain sight. Bessent has made it crystal clear, even a blind monkey can see this by now. When Scott Bessent entered his role, he promised three things to the US economy with his 333 plan. Now it sounds really tacky, but the details are important. He plans to expand US oil production by at least 3 million barrels a day. It's not just to earn more revenue, but to snatch back market share for US dollar transactions. And by targeting Iran, he gets to whack three birds with one stone. It hurts Iran's revenue, it slows down China's de-dollarization plan, and it dollarizes the world. And on the surface, it sounds like a really smart plan. However, it's still a very big gamble. Bessent might win this round and really drop Iran's oil flows by 90%, but this will incur the wrath of China. During the Munich conference, Wang Yi has already promised that Beijing will hit back at America's bullying tactics, that the tariffs won't go unpunished. Now, cutting China's oil supply is not a smart move. You are playing with fire. And if Beijing decides to impose yet another critical ban on the US economy, this could hammer essential industries. Now, Bessent might save the dollar a few more years of life in exchange for industrial and manufacturing and inflation crisis. But let me know what you think. Is Bessent really going to take a gamble with China, or will he back down and leave Iran alone? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.